Okay, hey everyone, this is lecture 14, and in this lecture we are going to find out what kind of tests to use when your dependent variable is numerical data. Okay, so just as a quick review, last week we looked at analyses where the dependent variable was categorical. And as an example of that, the binomial test can be used to compare a proportion with an expected value. So for example, suppose we had a sample of professional baseball pitchers and we collected data on their handedness, whether they were a right-handed pitcher or a left-handed pitcher. And we expect that about 10% of people are left-handed based on the prevalence of left-handedness in North America. And suppose we find out that in our sample of these professional baseball pitchers, 137 out of 491 of them are left-handed. So that's our observed sample proportion. Well, we can use a binomial test to test whether that differs from our expected value of 10%. And we run the test, and suppose this is the outcome we get. We'd report it as the proportion of left-handers among our pro baseball pitchers at 28%, that's 137 divided by 491, is significantly higher than 10% of left-handers found among the general population. And we report our binomial test with a p-value of a very, very small number that is less than 0.05, which is why we rejected the null hypothesis, and we report our sample size as well. So that's an example of an analysis of categorical data. But what if we had a numerical variable like age? So for example, in this class in the past, I had students guess the actor Keanu Reeves' age based on a photograph, and this is the distribution of age guesses that the students gave. And so suppose we want to compare the mean of that distribution with an expected value, like for example, Keanu's actual age. How would we analyze that? Instead of having this categorical variable, either left-handed or right-handed, we've got this numerical variable, right? That's got all these different numerical values for age. Well, we're going to get into that today. And we can test numerical data using features of the normal distribution. Remember, the normal distribution is this thing that shows up in very many places in nature. It's a symmetrical, roughly bell-shaped distribution with a single mode or a single peak. And it's really, really common. And the normal distribution follows this thing called a 68, 95, 99.7 rule. And it's just a mathematical description of what the normal distribution is. So this little diagram illustrates that rule. And so in this particular case, the mean of this normal distribution is at 0. And the green lines indicate 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations away from the mean. And so the normal distribution has these properties where 68% of the data will fall within about 1 standard deviation of the mean. 95% of the data will fall within about 2 standard deviations of the mean, and 99.7% of the data fall within about 3 standard deviations of the mean. So that's just a mathematical feature of this distribution that's so commonly found in nature. And we can use that to build up a null expectation for an analysis of a numerical variable. And when I say we, I mean your software does that, right? So suppose, for example, we have a null expected value of 0 for some test that we're running, and we expect some level of variance based on the variance we observe in the data. Well, we can plot on the mean that we actually observed, and we can calculate the probability of getting a mean that extreme or more extreme using these features of the normal distribution. So we can calculate a p-value this way. And we can determine if our data allow us to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so the first type of t-test we're going to talk about is called a one-sample t-test, and we could use that in the Keanu Reeves age example. The one-sample t-test is used when we want to compare the mean of a single numerical variable with a specific expected value. It involves a single numerical, which is assumed to be normally distributed, and the data are assumed to come from a random sample. In other words, all individuals are equally likely to be chosen and independent of each other. Remember, that assumption is true of all the tests that we're learning. So here are some examples of questions that can be addressed with a one-sample t-test. Is the average height of celebrities greater than 6 feet? is the average sugar content of today's batches of beer different from a target value of 133 degrees sugar content? Was the average daily snowfall in Ottawa last year greater than 1 centimeter per day? As a little bit of history background, t-tests were invented for beer, and they're also known, you'll often see in textbooks, that they're called the student's t-test. And the story of why goes back to this brewer named William Gossett. He was a brewer in the early 1900s. Guinness, the company at this time, was expanding production. They were producing millions of pints of beer per year. And it's really hard to make sure that your production process is consistent. So their customers wanted to get like kind of a consistent quality of beer. And in the early days, they would judge whether their beers were kind of up to par using subjective measures of look and fragrance. And Gossett was one of the first people to take a really scientific approach to doing this. And one of the first problems he wanted to solve was how many samples of beer did you need to measure to be confident that the sugar content, the degrees saccharin, was on target. And he figured out that he could use properties of the normal distribution to answer this question. And so he invented the t-test as a way of doing this. And it's one of the pillars of modern statistics. And it's an interesting story why it's called the student's t-test. And that's because Guinness, the company, didn't want their trade secrets to get out. So they had a policy that nobody that worked for them was allowed to publish their recipes or what they were experimenting on. But William Gossett knew that this method was revolutionary. And so he went to the board of directors and he made a case that he should be able to publish it. And ultimately, they allowed him to publish the paper on this method that he invented, as long as he didn't use the word beer in the paper, he didn't mention Guinness, and he didn't publish it using his own name. And so the paper where the t-test is first introduced is authored by this anonymous student. And that's why in your textbooks today, you'll see that it's called the student's t-test. All right. Okay, so let's go back to the example of like guessing ages. So let's call my actual age X. And let's say that we collect data on my apparent age by surveying students in the course, and I ask you all to guess how old you think I am. And we plan to analyze the data with a one sample t-test because we've got this single numerical variable, and we want to compare the distribution of your guesses and the mean of your guesses with my actual age. So that's what a one sample t-test is good for. Okay, so some practice questions, and we'll take these up on Zoom. First up, what would be the null hypothesis for this one sample t-test? What do you think the main hypothesis is? And suppose we rejected the null hypothesis in our one sample t-test and we get a p-value of less than 0.001. So it's smaller than our alpha threshold of 0.05. What could this mean? Explain the two possible scenarios and what the two different interpretations would be. So there's some missing information here. So there's two kind of possible ways you could reject that null hypothesis. So what could they be? Okay, so here's another little case study, and that's going to bring us into the other types of t-tests that we're going to cover today. So first, a bit of background. The research question for this case study is whether babies look more like their fathers or their mothers. This is a question that I'm always interested in when I meet a baby for the first time, like who does it look more like? But it might actually be an important question evolutionarily speaking, because we might predict in evolutionary history that fathers would be more likely to contribute to child rearing if they're convinced that a child is their own biological offspring. So it might be advantageous for babies if humans had evolved to have obvious resemblances to our dads at that early stage in life. Now, of course, it's always obvious to, like, the mother always knows who her own child is because she's the one who gave birth. So the question is, are babies particularly resembling of their fathers? Is that true? It's a kind of beautiful hypothesis. Okay, so we've got this hypothesis that babies might look like their fathers, and they might look more like their fathers than their mothers. And people set out to study this question in the 90s, and the way they did it was they showed people, like students like you, would come into the lab and look at photos of babies and look at photos of potential parents. And they showed them 3 potential parents for each baby, just like the one you see here. And the guessers, the participants in the experiment, had to guess, okay, who do you think this baby's father is? And they repeated this. The subjects would see babies and fathers, and then they would also see babies and mothers. Okay, so guess who this baby's father is, and I think I've got the answer written down somewhere, and we can take it up on Zoom. All right, so in their actual study, they had a sample size of 24 different babies, and each person that came in would rate the different babies, comparing them, or sorry, not rating them, but try to guess who their father was, and then separately they would be shown like 3 potential mothers. And the response variable would be the percent of correct guesses for these babies, right? So the sample size is the 24 babies, and the response variable is like a measure of how resembling that baby was to its true parent. Okay, so I already said how the procedure was repeated. So here's an example on the right of what the spreadsheet might look like, right? So each kind of unit in the experiment is a baby, and the variable, the next column there, is the percent of participants who correctly guess that baby's dad. So some babies that really look like their dad might have had a relatively high percent of correct guesses, like baby number 3 with 42, and some babies that don't really look like their dad might have had a relatively low percent correct guesses, like baby number 4 with only 15% of the participants correctly guessing the dad. So I just wanted to show you this to show you how this variable, percent correctly guessed for dad, is a numerical variable, right? So we've got these numbers in our spreadsheet. Okay, so as a practice question, given that the participants in the experiment, the guessers, saw 3 potential parents, if guesses were no better than random chance, what would you expect the average percent correct to be? Okay, so we'll take up the answer to that on Zoom. So given that each guesser was looking at 3 potential dads, what do you think the average of that numerical variable would be if guesses were no better than chance? So that's like our null hypothesis. Okay, and here's what the spreadsheet would look like, showing how we've got actually 2 sets of data here. We've got, for each baby, we've got its like resemblance to its dad, and we've got a measure of its resemblance to its mom. Okay, so this is how the authors of this study in 95 presented their results in a figure. So they had this bar graph with some error bar, and they've got the average percent correct plotted by the bar, and then there's some like margin of error around that. Now, so there are a number of problems with this graph. It's a poor graph in a couple of ways that we've covered in this course, and you should recognize that right away. For one thing, they're using a bar graph to plot numerical data. So that's always questionable because the bar graph only shows us the kind of single average value. It doesn't show us the underlying distribution. Secondly, we've got this magnitude problem where because they're using a bar graph to plot numerical data, they've chosen to cut it off. They've started the y-axis at a certain value, and it really gives you the visual impression of a big difference between the resemblance measures for mom and the resemblance measures for dad. So it greatly increases our visual perception of there being a difference here. Also, the caption, if you go and look at this paper, the caption never explains what the error bars are. Are they standard deviation? Are they standard error, 95% confidence interval? Those are some other measures that we're going to cover after the second midterm. But the caption needs to tell the reader what those error bars represent, and it does not. So let's replot the data and show it in a better way. So here I've decided to show it as a dot and whisker plot, mostly because we don't have the underlying data, so we can't show all of the data points. We can't show violin plots or box plots. Okay, so we've plotted the average percent correct guesses here, and we've plotted 95% confidence intervals as the error bars, and we've reported the sample size. And the red line here is the null expectation, given that each guesser was guessing out of 3 potential parents, right? So just by chance, we expect people to be able to guess the right parent a third of the time. And so that's why our null expectation here is 33.33%. Okay, so as a quick aside, so these are the 95% confidence intervals, this is the null expectation, and these are the means. As a quick aside, I want to tell you what 95% confidence intervals are. We are going to cover this after midterm 2. I just want to introduce it to you so you know what I'm putting on this graph, but you're not, it's going to be something that's important in this course after the next midterm. Okay, so as a brief introduction, 95% CIs are a measure of certainty on a numerical estimate like the mean. Okay, so here's what you need to know for now. The 95% confidence interval is telling you, given the sample data, this is how certain we are about the true population value. So really broad, really wide confidence intervals mean that we have low certainty about the true population value. And narrow, tight confidence intervals tell us that we have high certainty about the true population value. Okay, so here's a hypothetical example. So say we've got these 2 groups, kind of like the mom resemblance and the dad resemblance, and we've got our 2 means, and we've got confidence intervals, and we've got a null expectation shown in a dotted line. So we might, so we have high certainty about the average value of group 1, but we have quite low certainty about the average value of group 2, right? And so we've got these broad confidence intervals that actually overlap our null expectation. Now, the problem with the way the authors of that 1995 baby daddy study, the problem with what they did was they didn't directly compare the 2 groups. They compared each of the 2 groups to a null expectation, and that's problematic because what they did was they kind of did a 1 sample t-test for group 1 and a 1 sample t-test for group 2, and maybe you reject the null hypothesis for group 1 and you fail to reject it for group 2, but that doesn't mean that group 1 and group 2 are different. Really, if we want to compare these 2 groups, we need an analysis that directly compares the 2 means with each other. Because just because we reject the null in one case but not in the other, it doesn't mean that the 2 groups are significantly different. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we use what's called a 2-sample t-test. And we're going to cover 2 kinds of 2-sample t-tests. The first one is just the regular 2-sample t-test, and it compares the mean of a numerical variable for 2 different groups, hence the name 2-sample. And the whole goal of the 2-sample t-test is to ask, are the 2 groups different? Do they differ on this numerical variable? So you can also think of a 2-sample t-test as involving 2 variables, one being the numerical variable, the dependent variable, and the other being the categorical variable, which is the group membership here. And so the categorical variable has to have 2 levels, hence the name 2-sample, and the data from each group is assumed to be normally distributed. And as usual, the data are assumed to come from a random sample. So here are some examples of questions that can be addressed with 2-sample t-tests. Is the average height of celebrities greater than the average height of non-celebrities? Is the average sugar content of batch 1 different than the average sugar content of batch 2? Was the average daily snowfall in 2018 greater than the average daily snowfall in 2017? So I hope you can see, it'd be a good exercise even to set up kind of what the spreadsheet would look like for data for each of these questions, and hope you can see how it involves 2 variables, a numerical dependent variable and another variable which is categorical and which represents the membership in these 2 groups or 2 categories. Okay, one more type of test for the lecture today. The last type of t-test we're going to cover is another 2-sample t-test, but it's a paired version. So the paired t-test is also for comparing the mean of a single numerical variable for 2 different scenarios or 2 different samples to see if the scenarios are different. But instead of having two totally independent groups in a paired t-test, what we often have is like two measurements of the same individual, right? Or basically we have two non-independent measures. And what a paired t-test does is it asks whether the difference on average between those two measures is different from zero. As usual, the data are assumed to come from a random sample. So we'll look at some examples of this coming up. It might seem a bit abstract right now. Here's some examples of questions that can be addressed with a paired t-test. On average, was a student's grade on test number 2 lower than their grade on test number 1? And so in this example, suppose we might have 170 students and we compare each student's grade on the second test to their grade on the first test. Another example could be, is a player's average percent of wins at some game, like, I don't know, like ping pong or something, is their percent of wins at ping pong better after 10 hours of practice than their percent of wins before 10 hours of practice? And is there a decrease in the number of E. coli colonies on each petri dish after we apply antibiotic to it as compared to before, right? So suppose we add, like, just to kind of paint you a picture of this, we might have 30 petri dishes in this experiment and we count the number of colonies before we apply the antibiotic on each of those 30 plates, and then we count it again after we apply the antibiotic. So we're comparing the means of this numerical variable, this count, in these two scenarios, before and after. So we have like measurements of the same plate before and after. Okay, so as a quick practice question that we'll take up on Zoom, do you think that the baby parent analysis would be a paired t-test or an unpaired two-sample t-test? So if we want to ask, do babies resemble dads more than moms, would we run that as an unpaired t-test or a paired t-test? Okay, so just as a quick follow-up about this particular study, so the original study was done in 1995, but some other researchers repeated it in 1998, a few years later, because they kind of doubted the results, and they found that a couple of aspects of the way it was done were not really correctly done. And here's the data from the second study. So now, instead of plotting the kind of resemblance score as a percent, they're plotting it as a number of correct guesses. And so we're looking at the mean number of correct guesses in a whole bunch of different groups. They tested not just babies, they had photographs of like 1-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 5-year-olds. And so we're looking at the mean of these resemblance scores for mother and father for all three of these ages. And again, they had 3 potential parents. So the null expectation was that on average, like, there would be 10 out of 30 correct guesses. Okay, and so what did they find? Well, as you can see from this graph, they didn't find a big difference in resemblance for fathers and mothers. Fathers and mothers, they did not reject the null hypothesis. And what's more, they found that people were not very good at guessing parents in general, right? So none of their samples were, none of the babies in their sample were like being guessed correctly any more often than you'd expect by chance. So, if they ran a 1-sample t-test, they would fail to reject the null hypothesis that people could guess who the father was. Okay, so one last point before I wrap up this lecture. This fallacy of making an indirect comparison. So that's when we like test the null hypothesis for one group, test the null hypothesis for another, and then try to interpret something about those two different groups by looking at the two test results. That's incorrect to do, but it's surprisingly common in scientific studies. So it's something to be aware of. Just because you rejected the null for one group, but you did not reject the null for another, it doesn't mean that the two groups are significantly different from each other. And this can be important in meta-analyses as well. So for example, suppose we're testing a new drug, and suppose one study finds that this new drug has a significant effect, and another study finds that the new drug does not have a significant effect. And this graph illustrates one way that that can happen. So the line on the left is like the null hypothesis, and we've got these two studies, and we've got these confidence intervals, and the one in red has got these really broad confidence intervals, and they failed to reject the null, and in the blue study, they did reject the null. But just because those two conclusions were different, it doesn't mean that we have a paradox. It doesn't mean that there's a problem. It can very well happen that one study happens to reject the null and another doesn't, and yet they're perfectly consistent with each other. And that's because if we wanted to compare the two studies, we would need to do so directly, right? And so the reason that this misconception comes about is because when we do null hypothesis testing, we're turning our decision into this really dichotomous thing, like either reject the null or fail to reject it, when in reality, these things are like continuous in nature. Okay, so this slide just shows you what the software is calculating when you run these different kinds of t-tests. I don't get into these details in this course. You're not expected to know these details, but I just wanted to highlight that the test statistic for t-tests is like the t-statistic, and it involves computing a difference between a mean value and another expected mean value, or between two means for two different groups, and it also involves dividing it by a variance and sample size values. So that's what these formulas involve. You're not expected to know all of this. You're not expected to do this by hand, but I just wanted to show you what the software is doing. It's using information about the distribution in the data to formulate the test statistic that would be relevant for the null hypothesis. And then the software is comparing that test statistic, that t-value, to the distribution expected under the null. Okay, so that's it for this lecture on t-tests. We've got one more lecture before midterm number 2, and the next lecture will be kind of a review of null hypothesis testing and practice questions.